Good evening, everyone. Okay, so hi, hello, and welcome again to another live streaming of basic transfer pricing. And we will continue with our discussions kung saan po tayo stop noon, no? I would like to say hi sa ating mga ka-YouTubers, no? So, nandyan pa kayo at saka active, no? Thank you very much for watching. And itong ating topics about basic transfer pricing, guidelines pa lang ito, but we will have more topics, no, na dalhin natin dito sa YouTube channel natin, no? So, bago tayo magpunta sa transfer pricing methods, kasi transfer pricing methods na tayo ngayon, balikan natin yung determination of the arm's length results kung saan tayo nag-stop nung nakaraan, no? Ano ba yung determination ng arm's length results at ano ba yung arm's length, no? As a way of integration, balikan lang natin. Ano ba yung arm's length results? Yung arm's length results, since sabi natin, transfer pricing is observing the arm's length principle, no? Yun ang sinusunod ng transfer pricing, the arm's length principle. Ano ba yung arm's length principle? Ang arm's length principle is comparing the related party transactions with that of the independent transactions or the unrelated transactions. At ang sabi ng transfer pricing, the true transactions is the unrelated party transactions because it has no element of control. Ngayon, gumawa na tayo ng comparability analysis natin, nag-compare na tayo. So, we want to determine daw the arm's length result. Ano yung arm's length result? Yung result na pareho sila ng transactions, yung related party at saka yung independent party. Why? We want to determine na pareho sila kasi para malaman natin yung totoong pricing ng commercial or financial transactions, no? So, sabi po dito, once the appropriate transfer pricing method has been identified, such is applied on the data of independent party transactions to arrive at the arm's length result. What we are reading right now is the Revenue Regulations 2013, which is the transfer pricing guidelines po ng Pilipinas, no? So, in some cases daw, it will be possible to apply the arm's length principle to arrive at a single figure or specific ratio, the price or margin, that is the most reliable to establish whether the conditions of a transaction are arm's length. So, the effort exerted by the tax authorities in using this transfer pricing as a tool for auditing or ascertaining na arm's length ang transactions ng taxpayer, no? When you say arm's length, dapat same with the independent party. It is generally difficult to arrive at a specific ratio or range of deviation that may be considered as arm's length. More likely, the transfer pricing analysis would lead to a range of ratios. So, wala naman po talagang 100% na pareho pag na-compare tayo, no? So, may range lang. Hence, the use of ranges to determine the arm's length should be applied provided that the comparables are reliable. At ano po yung precaution natin when we use comparables? Dapat yung comparables natin is the independent party because our tested party are the related parties, so that our comparable should be independent party and has the same functions with our tested party, has the same characteristic, yung product and services, the same strategies, the same economic conditions, the same contractual terms, no? So, yun yung 5 comparability factors na dapat pareho sila apply natin when we compare. So, if the relevant conditions of the controlled transaction, the price or margin is within the arm's length range, no adjustment should be made. Kasi, kung within the arm's length range, meaning comparable sila. Kung sobrang taas o sobrang baba, hindi na sila comparable, no? So, if the relevant condition of the controlled transaction, price or margin, falls outside the arm's length range asserted by the Bureau, then the taxpayer should present proof or substantiation that the conditions of the controlled transaction satisfy the arm's length principle and that the result falls within the arm's length range. The arm's length range is different from the one asserted by the tax administration. So, sino may burden of proof ngayon na sabihin sa tax administration na ito yung dapat na arm's length range, no? Kasi magkaiba sila ng ginamit na comparables. So, anong sabi dito? Taxpayer should present proof or substantiation. So, dito na po papasok yung tinatawag natin na documentation. No? So, in transfer pricing, documentation is very important. That's why that documentation policies of these related parties dapat strict and saka dapat all pointing up to the observation of arm's length principle. Kasi pag hindi, mahihirapan sila at magkaroon sila ng adjustment. No? And when adjustment comes in, ito na yung may resulta na deficiency taxes or additional payment of taxes. Okay? So if the taxpayer is unable to establish this fact, the Bureau must determine the point within the arm's length range to which it will adjust the condition of the controlled transaction. So meron na tayong transfer pricing audit guidelines, so it's up to the examiner na i-determine niya ngayon na comparable ba or hindi using the arm's length range. No? Where comparability defects remain, no? in spite na nag-compare ka, may comparability defect pa rin, hindi sila magtali o hindi sila similar, it may be appropriate to use measures of central tendency to determine this point, for instance, the median, the mean, or the weighted averages, depending on the specific characteristic of the data set, in order to minimize the risk of error due to unknown or unquantifiable remaining comparability defects. So, feedback lang po dun sa mga nanonood, no, kung okay lang yung ating sounds, okay lang yung ating facing, no. Please try to write the comment diyan po sa comment portion ng ating YouTube. Yung ating Facebook okay na rin?
Okay na rin po, ma'am. May nanonood po 10.
Okay.
Sa YouTube po, 4.
Okay. So, okay lang yung ating sounds. Diretso lang po tayo, no? Let's now go to the comparability adjustment. Ano, what is this comparability adjustment? This is the differences between the transaction of the comparables and that of the tested party, which must be identified and adjusted for in order for the comparables to be useful as basis for determining the arm's length price. Comparability adjustment include accounting adjustment and functions risk adjustment. Actually, ang comparability adjustment, marami yan, no? Kasi depende sa transfer pricing issues, depende kung nasaan ginawa yung mga issues na yan sa transfer pricing, din doon din magkakaroon ng adjustment. No? So, hindi lang accounting, hindi lang functions, hindi lang risk. No? Lahat ng comparability factors. Comparability adjustments are intended to eliminate the effects of differences that may exist between situations being compared and that which could materially affect the condition being examined in the methodology, price or margin. No? This should not be performed to correct differences that have no material effect on the comparison. No? As these adjustments are neither routine nor mandatory in a comparability analysis. No? So, hindi mandatory ang gumawa ka kaagad ng adjustment. Depende pa yan sa result ng comparability analysis mo. No? Dito kasi sa Pilipinas, in the time pa noon ni Assistant Commissioner Valeroso, gumawa siya ng benchmarking ng 3 region, Valenzuela, Caloocan, Quezon City at saka 4 pala, Makati at saka Manila, no? So nagkaroon ng benchmark for companies, iba't ibang industries, no? May hardware, may construction, merong merchandising, mga restaurants. And then yun ang ginawa na benchmark or average, no, ng profit, gross profit ng mga establishment, and based on that, doon sila nag-start ng adjustment na nagpa-amend ng mga income tax return, nagbayad ng additional para mag-conform po doon sa benchmark, no? Yun ang ginawa noon. So when proposing a comparability adjustment, a resultant improvement or increase in the accuracy in the comparability should be demonstrated. So, dapat may increase in the accuracy ng comparability kasi kung hindi naman accurate yung pagka-compare, then it can be disputed in court. And there are so many cases in court na nakarating na the transfer pricing na may time na natatalo din yung tax authorities, no? So, just like in the case of the Amazon, no? Yung Amazon case, panalo dyan ang Amazon because yung definition ng intangibles, kung ano yung mga included in the term intangibles, ang sabi ng tax authority, all-encompassing ng IRS, no? Na marami siyang sinama doon sa salitang intangibles. Pero sa Amazon, konti lang yung kanyang isinama. Kaya yung valuation maliit lang, no? Unlike sa valuation ng IRS na sobrang laki. So, nung dinala nila sa korte, wala, hindi nanalo yung IRS. Ang nanalo ang Amazon, no? Okay. Okay. So, the following adjustments should be avoided as they do not improve comparability. Okay lang, nakikita pa ako sa Facebook? Okay. So, adjustment that are questionable when the basis for comparability criteria is only broadly satisfied, no? So, yun daw questionable na mga comparability na ginagawa, dapat i-avoid natin yan, no? Yung mga adjustments na yan. Excessive adjustment or adjustment that too greatly affect the comparable as such indicates that the third party being adjusted is actually not sufficiently comparable, no? Questionable yung comparable mo. Okay? So, kailan yan nangyayari? Especially kung wala talagang comparables because the industry where the tested party is in is unique, no? Or peculiar. So, wala ka talagang comparables. Number 3, adjustment on differences that do not materially affect the comparability. So, kung hindi naman siya talaga makaka-affect dun sa comparability, then do not adjust, no? And then number 4, highly subjective adjustments such as on the difference in product quality. Bakit highly subjective? Parang discretionary na masyado sa part ng revenue officers doing the adjustment. So, it should be avoided, no? Kasi highly subjective, that can be easily disputed, no? Okay. Okay, so let's now go to, ito talaga yung topic natin this tonight, no? This arm's length pricing methodologies. Ano ba yung mga arm's length methods na pwede natin gamitin, no? Number 1, this is the comparable uncontrolled price or CUP method, no? So this is the method as provided for in the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, no? So what are these about, no? The CUP method. The CUP method evaluates whether the amount charged in a controlled transaction is arm's length by reference to the amount charged in a comparable uncontrolled transactions in comparable circumstances. So, yung CUP, ang ini-evaluate niya yung amount. Ano yung amount? Price, no? Na-assign sa product, no? So, anong ginagawa dito? Compare the price of the related parties with that of the unrelated parties. And sino dapat na price ang magpe-prevail? The price of the unrelated party. So, you compare the price. So, any difference between the two prices may indicate the conditions of the commercial and financial relations of the associated enterprises are not arm's length and that the price in the uncontrolled transaction may need to be substituted for the price in the controlled transactions. So, pagka may difference ng dalawang price, dapat titingnan talaga kung ano yung mga conditions, ano yung mga criteria or factors that causes the differences, no? The use of the CAP method to determine transfer price entails identification of all the differences between the product or service of the associated enterprises and that of the independent party. Bakit i-identify mo yung mga differences? Kasi it will affect the price, no? So kung may mga differences sila in the agreement ng supplier at saka ng distributor doon sa product na pinag-uusapan, then titingnan yan, no? Kung how does it affects the price of the product, no? Halimbawa, yung price ng isang product, halimbawa na lang, damit, no? So, sa related party, ang bintahan 100 pesos, sa independent party naman, ang bintahan 150, no? So, when you analyze ano bang difference nila, mas maganda pala yung klase ng independent party kaya mas mahal siya. So, in that case, you identify the reason kung bakit magkaiba sila ng price, no? So, if these differences have a material effect on the price, adjustment of the price of products sold or services rendered by the independent party to reflect these differences shall be made to arrive at the arm's length price, no? So, comparability analysis under the CAP method shall take into account the following, no? Ano yung following na yan? Kasi kung may material effect sa price, yung differences, then titingnan at diyan na umpisa na magkaroon ng adjustment. Okay. Product characteristics such as physical features and quality. So, ito yung mga dahilan, no? Bakit sila magkaiba ng price? Kasi syempre, iba yung hitsura ng isa, no? May bearing ba kung pangit o maganda? Yes, meron. Lalo na sa product. Pag maganda yung hitsura ng product mo, it command a better price. Pag pangit, walang papansin. Kahit ibenta mo ng mura, ayaw bilhin, no? So, product characteristics such as physical features and quality, no? So, may bearing po yan sa differences. Kaya, pag yan ang difference, pwede kang mag-adjust, no? If the product is in the form of services, no, the nature and extent of such services provided. No? So, ano ba yung nature ng service? Ano ba yung extent ng such services? So, you compare. Number 3, whether the goods sold are compared at the same points in the supply or production chain. No? So, ano ba yung goods sold? No? So, are the same at the same points in the supply or production chain. So, dapat pareho sila na retailer o kaya pareho sila na distributor, no? Para ma-compare mo yung products nila, pareho sila ng functions. Kasi kung hindi sila, siyempre iba yung presyo ng distributor, iba yung presyo ng retailer na, no? Sino ang mas mura? Siyempre the distributor. Sino ang mas mahal? The reseller, no? Okay. Number 2, if the product is in the form of services, the nature and extent of such services, dapat kino-consider din natin yung nature and extent of the services because it will affect the price of the service, no? So, whether the goods sold are compared at the same points in the supply or production chain, no? So, same point ba, no? Nasa distribution na ba siya or nasa reseller na, no? So, magkaiba sila ng point, no? In the supply or production chain. Number 4, product differentiation in the form of patented features such as trademarks, designs, and other. So, So, yun yung mga differences, no, sa price ng product. Volume of sales, if it has an effect on price, no, laki ng effect ng volume of sales as compared doon sa kaunti lang na discount makukuha niya. Okay. Timing of sale, if it is affected by seasonal fluctuations or other changes in market conditions, no? So, timing ng sale, sa linman pa siya o sa December na marami yung purchasing power ng tao o kailan ba siya nagkaroon ng sale, no? So, timing of sale. Number 7, whether cost of transport, packaging, marketing, advertising, and warranty are included in the deal, no? So, meaning na included, sino ba yung mag-absorb o magbabayad nun? Okay. Number 8, whether the products are sold in places where the economic conditions are the same, no? So, economic conditions are the same ba para masabi natin na kaya pala pareho sila ng price, no? So, number 9, whether a business strategy is adopted in the controlled transaction that would produce material difference on the price of the controlled transaction as against the price in an uncontrolled transaction. So, anong sinasabi dito? The business strategy, no? Okay. So, yun po yung comparable uncontrolled price method, no? So, anong strength ng comparable uncontrolled price method? The comparable uncontrolled price method is the most accurate na comparability method, no? But, ano naman yung constraint o yung weakness ng comparability? The comparable uncontrolled price method has an influence on the characteristic, no? Kasi pag magkaiba yung characteristic, hindi na sila comparable. So, you cannot choose the comparable uncontrolled price method, no? Okay. Okay. So, the resale price method evaluates whether the amount charged in a controlled transaction is at arm's length by reference to the gross profit margin. So, ano palang kino-compare sa resale price method? The gross profit margin, no? Realized in comparable uncontrolled transactions, this method is generally appropriate where the final transaction is made with an independent party, no? So, yung resale price, ini-evaluate niya yung amount charged in a controlled transaction is at arm's length, no? Okay. Ano yun?
Palitan ko lang po yung sa cellphone. Nagko-close po yung Facebook. Correct. Nakalagay mang over. Ito po yung cellphone.
Ha? Over?
Ito. Nagko-close yung Facebook.
Bakit?
Palitan ko ng cellphone.
It was causing your cell phone overheat.
Kaya nagpo-force close yung Facebook. Nakakat yung type. Try ko po ibang cellphone.
Pero mo alam nila na nag-overheat, ha? Totoo naman, oh.
Baka ayaw nang nakasabay nyo naka-charge mo. Ay, charge ko muna ito. Kasi nakaraan ito gamit yung...
Dapat kasi kanina pa yan, inano. Sige. Okay, so we are now discussing on the resale price method, no? So, ano sabi po dito? The usefulness of the method, meaning the resale price method, largely depends on how much added value or alteration the reseller has done. Kasi sa resale price method, ano ba yung activity niya dito? Bumili lang ng goods and then binenta, kaya resale price, no? Okay. So, anong kino-consider dito? The value added, binili niya yung product, meron ba siyang added value? Meron ba siyang alteration o ginawa pa ba niya na in-improve pa niya yung product? no? Bago niya i-resolve. Or the time lapse between purchase and onward sale, no? So, resale price method is most appropriate in a situation where the reseller adds relatively little value to the properties. So, ang resale price method daw, applicable siya kung nag-add man siya ng value pero very little lang, no? Okay. So, the greater the value added to the properties by the reseller, for example, through complicated processing or assembly with other products, or the longer the time lapse, no? Kasi may holding period na pag longer time lapse. To the extent that market conditions might have changed. No? So, before it is resolved, or when the reseller contributes substantially to the creation or maintenance of an intangible property that is attached to the product, such as trademarks or trade names, the more difficult is to use resale price method to arrive at the arm's length price. Mahihirapan ka na pagka may mga intangibles na pumasok dun sa transactions, no? So, RPM, mahirap nang i-apply o yung gamitin na methods, no? So, you should choose other methods. Okay. Ano yan? Sira pa rin?
Yeah, okay na po. Nice po.
So, the starting point in resale price method is the price, no? So, the resale price at which a product that has been purchased in a controlled sale is then resold to an independent third party, or the uncontrolled sale, no? So, the price or the resale price is then reduced by the appropriate gross margin, the resale price margin, representing the amount out of which the reseller would seek to cover its selling and other operating expenses, and in the light of functions performed, taking into account assets used and risk assumed, make an appropriate profit. No? So, yun ang sinasabi dito, na yung resale price is reduced by the appropriate gross margin, kasi ang anong i-compare natin between related party and independent party if the transaction is reselling, no? So, compare the gross margin, no? So, yung paano yung gross margin? Sales less cost of sales or direct cost equals gross profit margin. Okay. So, the arm's length price for the original transfer of property between associated enterprises or the controlled transaction is obtained after subtracting the gross margin, resale price margin, from the resale price, and adjusting for other costs associated with the purchase of the product, such as customs duties, no? So, marami pa yan na mga factors, no, yung nag-i-influence. So, the following are the factors which may influence the resale price margin and other considerations. So, when performing a comparability analysis for purposes of the resale price method. So, ito na yung mga factors which are the comparability factors. And mind you, these 5 comparability factors na tinuro ng OECD, applicable to lahat, sa lahat ng methods, no? Gagamitin mo lahat to. Okay? So, functions or level of activities performed by the reseller and the risk undertaken. So, you have to consider that also. Whether the reseller is merely a forwarding agent or a distributor who assumes full responsibility for marketing and advertising the product by risking its own resources in these activities. So, in this case, iba siya ng presyo, no? Kasi marami pa siyang inadoon na makakatulong sa product, which is marketing and advertising, no? So, that should be considered. Okay. So, whether similar assets are employed in the controlled and uncontrolled transactions, for instance, develop distribution network, no? I would like to remind na yung ating live streaming po, we will entertain questions, not necessarily questions pertaining to our topics tonight, but any question po that you would like to ask, sasagutin po natin, no? So, shout out ulit sa mga ka-YouTubers. Ilan na sila?
Sa YouTube, ma'am, 5 po.
Okay.
Sa Facebook, 7.
Hindi sila nagsabi kung sino yung mga yan?
Wala pong nag-comment.
Okay, sige. So, tuloy lang po tayo, no? So, anong gagawin natin dito sa comparability? Ano yung unang comparability factors natin or paano tayo mag-compare? Number 1, we compare the functions or level of activities performed by the reseller and the risk undertaken, no? So, the functions or level of activities, we have to see to it kung nakaka-affect ba yan dito sa comparability, no? So, whether the reseller is merely a forwarding agent or a distributor who assumes full responsibility for marketing and advertising the product by risking its own resources. Anong risking its own resources? Siya ang sarili niyang gumastos, no? Kasi halimbawa, hindi pa kilala yung product, introduce pa niya sa market. So, mag-i-incur pa siya ng marketing and advertising cost para makilala yung product at magkaroon ng share in the market. Number 2, whether similar assets are employed in the controlled and uncontrolled transactions, no? For instance, a developed distribution network. Okay. Number 3, although broader product differences are allowed as compared to the CAP method, product similarities are still significant to some extent, no? Particularly when there is a high value or unique intangible attached to the product, no? So, parang sa CAP method, may mga differences doon na allowed, and also product similarities still significant to some extent, but there is a high value or unique intangible attached to the product, no? Number 4, if the resale price margin used is that of an independent enterprise in a comparable transaction, then the differences in the way business is managed may have an impact on profitability, no? May impact talaga siya sa profitability. Number 5, the time lapse between original purchase and resale of the product. As a longer time lapse may give rise to changes in the market, exchange rates, cost, and others, no? Apektado. Kasi may holding period siya. Number 6, whether the reseller is given exclusive rights to resell the products. Why? Kasi kung may exclusive rights siya to resell the products, that is an intangible for the reseller, no? Number 7, differences in accounting practices where adjustment must be made to ensure that the components of cost in arriving at gross margin in the controlled and uncontrolled transactions are the same. So, ano ba yung accounting practices or accounting standards? Dapat same sila para wala nang adjustments, no? Number 8, whether cost of transport, packaging, marketing, advertising, and warranty are included in the deal, no? So, yung mga cost ng transport, packaging ng products, no? So, marketing and advertising and warranty, dapat included sila in the deal, no? Number 9, whether the products are sold in places where the economic conditions are the same, no? So, kailangan yung economic conditions of the place pareho kung mag-compare ka, no? Number 10, whether a business strategy is adapted in the controlled transaction that would produce material difference on the resale price margin of the controlled transaction as against the resale gross margin in an uncontrolled transaction, no? So, business strategy is consider din po natin, no? Okay. So gross profit margins represent the gross compensation after cost of sales, no? Kaya paano natin compute yung gross margin, no? Sales less cost of sales equals gross margin, or sale of services less direct cost, no? Equals the gross margin or the gross income, no? So where the related and independent party transactions are comparable in all aspects, no, except for the product itself, RPM might produce a more reliable measure of arm's length conditions than the CAP method, no? So nonetheless, it can be expected that the more comparables the products, the more likely it is the RPM will produce better results, no? Okay, so yun po yung resale price method, no? So far we have discussed the comparable uncontrolled price method and the cost plus the resale price method, no? So dalawa na. So sa comparable uncontrolled price method, we compare the price. Sa resale price method, we compare the gross margin, no? Now let's go to the third factors, the cost plus method, no? So cost plus focuses on the gross markup, no? So parang resale price method din kanina na markup, gross margin ang ginagamit, no? So CPM focuses on the gross markup obtained by a supplier who transfers property or provides services to a related purchaser. So essentially, the method attempts to value the functions performed by the supplier or the property of the property or services, no? CPM is most useful where semi-finished goods are sold between associated enterprises or where the controlled transaction involves the provision of services, no? So walang tanong?
Wala pa po. Wala akong nagko-comment.
Okay. So tuloy lang tayo. Sa Facebook wala rin.
Wala rin.
Okay. So, for the cost plus method, no, sabi dito, focuses on the gross markup, no? So, ano ang kino-compare dito? The gross markup or the gross profit margin, no? I-compare mo sa comparables mo. No? Obtained by a supplier who transfer property or provide services to a related purchaser, no? So essentially, the method attempts to value the functions performed by the supplier of the property or services, no? CPM is most useful where semi-finished goods are sold between associated enterprises or where the controlled transaction involves the provision of services, no? So sa cost plus method, ano ba sabi, ibig sabihin ng cost plus? The cost, no? So yung tinitingnan dito sa cost plus method, magkano yung gross profit margin mo, and then yan ang kino-compare with the other comparables, no? So be careful also in choosing your comparables. Okay, so cost plus method indirectly measures whether the price for the property or service in the controlled transaction is an arm's length price, no? By assessing whether the markup on the cost incurred by the supplier of the property or service in the controlled transaction meets the arm's length standard, no? So, basta nag-aaral ka ng transfer pricing, palagi mong ilagay sa sarili mo yung arm's length standard, no? That you have to follow. So, the method is often useful in cases involving the manufacture, assembly, or other production of goods that are sold to related parties or where control transaction involves the provision of intra-group services, no? So yung ang ginagamit nila, the cost plus method. Okay, so starting point of the cost plus method is the cost, no, incurred by the supplier of property or services in a control transaction for property transferred or services provided to a related purchaser. An appropriate markup is added to this cost to find the price that the supplier should be charging the buyer. No? So yung cost base used in determining cost and the accounting policy should be consistent and comparable between the controlled and uncontrolled transaction. No? So dapat pareho lang yan. And over time in relation to the particular enterprises. The cost referred to in CPM are the aggregation of direct and indirect cost of production. Kasi nga manufacturing. So ano yung activity niya? Nagmamanufacture o nagde-develop ng product. No? So, comparability when applying cost plus method should take into account the similarity of functions, performed, assets, used, and risk assumed. No? And then the contractual terms, the market conditions, and business strategies, as well as any adjustment made to account for the effects of any differences in the aforementioned factors between the controlled and uncontrolled transactions. Ito yung magko-compare ka na sa CPM mo, the cost plus method. No? Ano ba yung similarity nila sa functions, sa assets used, and then sa risk. No? Kasi sabi natin, yung 5 comparability factors, apply natin yun sa lahat ng method. No? So, comparability analysis under CPM shall take into account the following. No? So, functions or level of activities performed by the seller and the risk undertaken. No? So, ano ba yung functions niya or level of activities performed? No? Whether the similar assets are employed in the controlled and uncontrolled transactions. So, you have to compare. No? Although broader product differences are allowed as compared to the CAP method, product similarities are still significant to some extent, no? Kasi ang product similarity is very important siya sa comparable and controlled price method because price ang gino-compare and the characteristics, the kung ano man yung functions, talagang nakaka-apekto siya doon sa comparability, no? So if the gross margin used is that of an independent enterprise in a comparable transaction, then the differences in the way business is managed may have an impact on profitability. No? Differences in accounting practices, no? Where adjustment must be made to ensure that the components of cost in arriving at gross margins in the controlled and uncontrolled transactions are the same. So, hindi na tayo mahirapan ngayon because sa reporting pa lang, sa corporations is easy. Ang pinapagamit sa atin ngayon is the International Financial Reporting Standard. So, pare-pareho na. Oh, so, hindi tayo mahirapan sa accounting practices. Oh. So, whether the cost of transport, packaging, marketing, advertising, and warranty are included in the deal. No? Kasi bakit sila magkaiba ng gross profit? Because the cost of transport, packaging, marketing, advertising, and warranty are included in the deal, no? So, siyempre, kung kasama yung marketing, advertising, warranty, mas mataas ang price, no? Or yung gross profit margin. So, number 7, whether the products are sold in places where the economic conditions are the same. So, ito yung economic conditions. Whether a business strategy is adopted in the control transaction that would produce material difference on the cost plus markup of the control transaction as against the cost plus markup in an uncontrolled transaction. No? Okay. So, ano tong tinatawag natin na business strategy? Iba-iba to, no? But these business strategies, when employed by the taxpayer, should only be temporary. No? Hindi naman pwede na since may business strategy ka, forever mo na gagawin, no? Business strategy is adopted in the control transaction, produce material difference on the cost plus markup. So, material po yung difference ng business strategy, no? So, yan na yung basis na magko-compare na tayo. No? So, as in resale price method, fewer adjustments may be necessary to account for product differences under cost plus method than the cap method. No? So, it may be appropriate to focus on the other factors of comparability such as the functions performed and economic circumstances. No? So, kung fewer adjustment lang necessary sa account, no? So, focus on the other factors, no? Ano yung other factors? Marami. Yung 5 comparability factors na sinasabi sa atin ng OECD, and the examples are the functions performed, economic circumstances. They are the example of, sabi na natin, other factors that should be considered. Okay. So, where the associated enterprise and independent party transactions are not comparable, hindi sila comparable, in all aspects, and the differences have a material effect on the margin, taxpayers are expected to make appropriate adjustment to eliminate the effects of these differences. No? So, talagang yung adjustment should be done to eliminate the effect of these differences. No? In all aspects, and the differences have a material effect. So, ilan na tayong method. We have the comparable uncontrolled price method, followed by the resale price method, and the cost plus method. Now, let's go to the fourth, which is the profit split method. No? So, ano ba itong profit split method? You split the profit. Anong klaseng profit ang split mo dito? The net profit or the profit after tax. No? So, profit split method seeks to eliminate the effect of profits of special conditions made or imposed in a controlled transaction or in controlled transactions that are appropriate to aggregate. No? So, by determining the division of profits or losses, the independent enterprises would have expected to realize from engaging in the transaction or transactions. No? So, tuloy tayo sa paano ba ito ginagawa yung profit split or paano ba yung mag-split ng profit at ano yung mga criteria or factors na kailangan natin gamitin. No? So, profit split method provides alternative in cases where no comparable transactions between independent parties can be identified. So, wala talaga, hindi mo ma-identify yung, di mo ma-compare, no? Yung related party at saka independent party, no? So, anong alternative cases? Kasi no comparable transactions ang meron. So, gamitin mo ngayon yung profit split. So, this is true normally in a situation where transactions are very interrelated that they cannot be evaluated separately or in situations involving a unique intangible. Yan na. Pagka may intangible na, hindi mo na pwede gamitin yung traditional na method, yung comparable uncontrolled price, resale price, at saka yung cost plus method. No? So, ano na yung pwede mong gamitin? The profit split. Kasi, highly interrelated yung kanilang activity. Okay. So, the method is based, ito po yung sinasabi natin na profit split method. This is based on the concept that profits earned in a controlled transaction should be equitably allocated among associated enterprises involved in the transactions. So, economically valid basis approximates the allocation of profits that would have been anticipated and reflected in an agreement made at arm's length. So, yun po yung sa profit split natin, no? So we split the profits. Highly integrated ang activity ng related parties. No? And then wala pang comparables. No? So yun yung sa profit split. The profit to be split is the operating profit. No? Ano pala yung i-split? The operating profit. But it may be appropriate to carry out a split on the gross profit and then deduct the expenses incurred by or attributable to its relevant party. No? So, split of the gross profit, deduct the expenses incurred. No? Kaya, ang i-distribute mo or i-split mo ngayon, yun na yung net profit, no? Kasi gross profit less the expenses. So the allocation of profit or loss under the profit split method shall be made in accordance with the following approaches. And what are these approaches? No? So number 1, residual profit split approach, no? Yung isa yung contribution profit. Resale profit, residual profit split approach, no? The combined profits from the controlled transactions under examinations are split into stages. So, ano yung 2 stages na pag-split? In the first stage, each participant is allocated sufficient profit to provide it with a basic return appropriate to the type of transaction in which it is engaged. No? Sa first stage, allocate muna sa kanila yung sufficient profit. No? Ordinarily, this basic return would be determined by reference to the market return achieved for similar types of transactions by independent parties. No? And then the basic return would generally account for the value with reference to comparable independent market data. No? May comparable market data of the contribution or functions performed by its party and not account for the return that would be generated by any unique and valuable assets possessed by the participants. No? So, ano yung valuable assets possessed by the participants? Those are intangibles. So, in the second stage, any residual profit or loss remaining after the first stage division would be allocated among the parties based on an analysis of the facts and circumstances that might indicate how this residual would have been divided between independent parties. No? So, taking into consideration the value of unique assets used by the parties, usually intangible assets. So, dito na po mag-come in kung may mga intangible assets, ano yung method na gagamitin natin. Pwede ng profit split and yung isa pa, yung transactional net margin method. Okay. So, what to do next? The remaining profit, which is attributable to such unique assets, is allocated between the parties based on the relative contribution of parties to the creation of such assets. Siyempre, kung ano yung contribution mo, doon ka bibigyan ng share, no? Taking into consideration how independent parties would have divided such residual profits in similar circumstances, no? So, anong sinasabi dito na independent parties, no? So, yung hindi related parties, no? Papaano nila i-divide yung residual profits in similar circumstances, no? So, yung next po na kind of profit split, yung kanina residual profit split, is the contribution profit split approach, no? So in this kind of splitting the profit, the combined profits, which are the total profits from the controlled transactions under examinations, are divided between the associated enterprises in a single stage based upon the parties' relative contribution to the profit. So, i-divide na sa mga associated enterprises that contributes, no, sa cost nila. So, relative contribution to the profit or the relative value of the functions performed by each of the associated enterprises participating in the controlled transaction, supplemented as much as possible by external market data that indicate how independent enterprises would have divided profits in similar circumstances. Kaya nga tayo nagko-compare, no? At ang hinahanap natin pag nag-compare tayo na yung arm's length. Paano ba yung independent parties or enterprises dinidivide nila yung profit between them, no? Ang tawag doon arm's length, no, na pag-divide ng profit. So, yun po yung dalawang klase ng profit split. Now we go to the fifth method, which is the transactional net margin method. This transactional net margin method, ano naman ang kino-compare dito? No, sa pangalan pa lang, ano yung kino-compare? The net margin, no? So, TNMM operates in a manner similar to the cost plus and resale price methods in the sense that it uses the margin approach. So, margin approach, yung profit, no? Gross profit, yung resale price, at saka cost plus. But, ito namang transactional net margin, the net margin po ang ginagamit, ang i-compare, no? So, method examines the net profit margin relative to appropriate base such as cost, sales, assets attained by the member or group of controlled taxpayer from a controlled transaction. No? Okay, so magkano ba yung net margin? No? Kasi yung margin na yan, yun ang i-compare mo with your comparables to arrive at malalaman nyo kung ano yung arm's length price or margin. No? So, TNMM compares the net profit margins attained by an entity from a related party transaction to those attained by the same entity in uncontrolled transactions or by comparable independent entities involved in similar transactions. No? So, relative to some appropriate base such as cost, sales, or assets. No? So, yung basis mo can be cost, the sales, or the assets. Kasi pag may compare ka, may basis ka, no? May appropriate base ka. So, in short, TNMM evaluates whether the amount charged in a controlled transaction is arm's length. No? Arm's length pa yung amount charged by reference to the operating profit earned in comparable uncontrolled transactions. No? So, yun yung ini-evaluate po ng transactional net margin method. So, being a transactional profit method, typically applied to only one of the parties involved in the transaction, TNMM is closely aligned to the resale price and cost plus method. So, para siyang cost plus method din and resale price method. The similarity means that this method requires a level of comparability, no? So, yung profit level, similar to that required for the application of the two traditional transaction methods, which is the resale price and the cost plus, no? So, yung dalawa, resale price method and also the cost plus method. So, ano yung primary difference ng TNMM, RPM or CPM? So, yung resale price at saka cost plus method, focus on the net margin ang TNMM. Instead na yung dalawa, resale price at saka cost plus, focus on the gross margin of the transaction. No? One of the weaknesses of using net margin as the basis for comparison is that it can be influenced by many factors that either do not have an effect or have a less substantial or direct effect on price or margin. Bakit? Nasaan ba yung net margin? If you try to look at the income statement, nasaan ba yung net margin? Nandoon na siya sa pinaka-baba. Ano ba yung nandun sa taas pa? Sales, less cost of sales or direct cost equals gross profit, less operating expenses. Diyan sa operating expenses, napakaraming factors yan that affects the net margin, no, na mailalagay mo doon. Kaya yung sabi nga nila, yan ang weakness ng transactional net margin method. No? So, what are the example? Example of factors include the efficiency of plant and machinery used, management and personnel capabilities, competitive position, and others. So, ito yung mga factors that affect, no, the net margin. No? So, unless reliable and accurate adjustment can be made to account for these differences, the transactional net margin may not produce reliable measures of the arm's length net margin. So, yun yung weakness niya. Okay? TNMM is usually appropriate to use when the gross profit of the business is not easy to determine. Kasi wala kang data, kaya hindi mo compute yung gross profit. So, since available ang net margin, so net margin ang gagamitin mo. No? So, in case of manufacturer or service provider or RPM in case of distributor cannot be used. No? So, the net margin figure is always available. No? Transactional net margin method may be used instead. So, applying the same formula as those for CPM, for manufacturer, service provider, or RPM, resale price for distributor. But, using the margin in lieu of the gross profit. No? So, yun ang gagamitin ng TNMM or the transactional net margin method. No? The net margin instead of the gross margin. Okay. So, I have discussed to you yung transfer pricing methods. And what are those methods? We have the comparable uncontrolled price method. Paano tayo nagko-compare sa price? We compare the price and ano yung factor na very important that can influence the price, the characteristic or nature of the service or goods, no? Whether tangible or intangible. And ano pa yung nakaka-improve ng price? The quality, no? Kasi pagka may difference sa characteristics, may naturally magkaiba ang price, no? Pagka magkaiba ang quality ng product compared, magkaiba talaga ang presyo because of the quality factor, no? So, anong aim natin dito sa comparability? We want to see the real price of the goods. At ang sabi natin, the real price is that of the independent price. Kaya, we are comparing the price of the independent party and the price of the related parties, no? So, yung sunod natin na comparable uncontrolled price, ang next is the resale price method. Ano naman tong resale price method? We compare the gross profit, no? Ano tong gross profit, resale price method? Ito yung bibili siya ng product and then i-resale niya, wala siyang mga material na added value to the product, no? Binili lang niya, tapos kunti lang yung ginastos niya, binenta na niya ulit. No? Kaya resale lang siya. So, ano ang compare natin? The gross profit margin. No? Titingnan mo ngayon kung tama ba yung margin niya na nire-report. Considering na yung functions niya, binili lang naman niya, tapos binenta agad. No? So, yung next natin is the cost plus method. Ano naman tong cost plus method? Usually, ito yung cost plus the markup, no? So, yung profit na mina-markup. So, usually sa mga independent parties, ano dapat yung markup, no? Halimbawa, manufacturing company ka, tama ba na yung markup ka lang ng 10% o 20%? Sa 20%, kasama pa doon yung operating expenses mo? Of course not, no? So, it's not arm's length. Okay. So, we have discussed to you the cost plus, so yung profit split, and then the transactional net margin method. No? So, yung profit split, highly integrated ang operation ng company, ng mga related parties. So, since highly integrated, hindi mo ma-pinpoint yung isa providing only services to the other. That's why, ano dapat gawin? Split the profit. No? Kasi yung iba, hindi naman nag-generate ng sales o ng cash, but just helping to the other company para makapag-generate ng sales. No? So, dapat meron silang share sa profit. Okay. Now, let's go to the advanced pricing arrangement and the mutual agreement procedure. Ano ba itong advanced pricing arrangement or the mutual agreement procedure? This is the facility available to taxpayer who are engaged in cross-border transactions. No, ano itong klaseng facility na to? This is the agreement entered into between the taxpayer and the Bureau to determine in advance the appropriate set of criteria, method, comparables, and appropriate adjustment thereto. No? So, ito yung advanced pricing arrangement, parang ruling to, kukuha ka sa BIR, and then pa-approve mo na yung pricing mo. Ano yung pricing mo? Yun yung gross profit rate what sa transactional net, sa net margin, no? Yun yung ipa-approve mo na tama yung method na ginamit mo. So, to ascertain the transfer prices of controlled transactions over a fixed period of time, no? So, the purpose of an APA is to reduce the risk of transfer pricing examination and double taxation. Bakit? Kasi in advance, hindi ka na ma-audit dahil in advance nagpa-evaluate ka na and then nag-show ka na ng proof na ito tama yung ginawa ko. No? Or yung pricing ko is tama, no? So anong gagawin mo dito? Magpe-present ka rin ng transfer pricing analysis report. No? Okay. So what are the two kinds of advanced pricing arrangement? The unilateral APA and the bilateral or multilateral APA, no? So ano itong unilateral APA? Agreement involving only the taxpayer and the BIR, while bilateral or multilateral APA is an agreement involving Philippines and one or more of its treaty partners. No? Bilateral or multilateral APA is authorized under the Mutual Agreement Procedure, article of the 37 Philippine tax treaties. No? 37 tax treaties pa lang noon, pero ngayon 43 na yung Philippine tax treaties with other countries. No? It is not a mandatory requirement for taxpayers to avail of an APA for their controlled transaction. No? So if a taxpayer avails of the APA, it may choose freely between a unilateral and bilateral or multilateral APA. No? So, hindi naman mandatory requirements that you avail of the advanced pricing arrangement. No? Voluntary lang. But, ano yung iwasan mo doon? The risk of being audited. Kasi hindi ka submit ng APA mo. No? Advanced pricing arrangement. If a taxpayer does not choose to enter into an APA and its transactions are subject later on to transfer pricing adjustments, it may still invoke the MAP article to resolve double taxation issues. No? Okay. So, ano naman tong Philippine Tax Treaties? No? The Philippine Tax Treaties article on MAP provides a mechanism for the Philippine competent authority to mutually arrive at satisfactory solution with the competent authority of the treaty partner to eliminate double taxation issues arising from transfer pricing adjustments. Kailan nangyayari itong tinatawag natin na double taxation, no? In particular sa mga transaction, no? Ano to? May competent authority of the treaty partner, no? May treaty partner tayo, which I told you, meron na tayong 43 countries na meron tayong tax treaty, no? So, how to eliminate double taxation issues arising from transfer pricing adjustment? Paano yan nangyayari? Halimbawa, yung multinational companies, meron siyang subsidiary dito sa Pilipinas. Dito sa Pilipinas, ever since, wala siyang nire-report na income, no, dito sa Pilipinas. Why? Kasi services lang yun dito sa Pilipinas, nagsiservisyo lang doon sa ibang companies, no? So, during the transfer pricing audit, it was found out na dapat instead of the cost plus na method na gagamitin, it should be profit split. Why? Kasi highly integrated yung business, so dapat lang ang Pilipinas may share doon sa income earned by the parent company, no? So actually case ko to awa ko talaga no? So I nag-adjust talaga ako. Inano ko na profit split dapat. So merong income talaga ang Pilipinas dito, no? Anong in-invoke nung accountant? The mutual agreement procedure that ang sabi nila, kung magdagdag ka ng profit dito, that profit has already been subjected to tax and reported in other country, no? So na-report na 'yun doon sa ibang bansa at nabayaran na yung tax. So pag nag-assess ka pa dito, ibig sabihin ibalik mo yung income na yan dito, nabayad na sa ibang bansa. So magkaroon na ng issue ng double taxation, no? This is true, no? Pero ang sabi ng OECD, double taxation is not per se avoided. Sometimes it is allowed. Why? Bakit siya allowed yung double taxation? Because it is intentional the part of the taxpayer na hindi talaga mag-report ng income dito sa Pilipinas kasi mataas yung ating income tax rates, no? So saan sila na declare ng income? Doon sa branch or sa related party na mababa lang yung tax in order to save for the payment of taxes. Na doon sila sa mga tax haven countries, no? So the Bureau shall issue separate guidelines on the application of APA and the MAP, no? So sabi yan ng regulations. Documentation. Now let's go to the documentation. Ano ba yung mga nire-require na documentation? So tayo dito sa Pilipinas, meron tayong bago na Revenue Regulations 19-2020 requiring those companies with related party transactions to attach BIR Form 1709, which is the transfer pricing documentation, when we file the annual income tax return of companies, no? So yun yung latest dito sa documentation. Documentation, the taxpayer must demonstrate that their transfer prices are consistent with the arm's length principle. Yun ang laman ng documentation mo, no? So main purpose of keeping adequate documentation is for taxpayers to be able to, number 1, defend their transfer pricing analysis. Number 2, prevent transfer pricing adjustments arising from tax examinations and support their applications for MAP, no? So yun ang purpose. Bakit meron tayong adequate na documentation for taxpayers? Okay, so taxpayers who have not prepared adequate documentation may find their application for MAP rejected or that the transfer pricing issue would be much more difficult to resolve. Kasi dito sa MAP, sa Mutual Agreement Procedure, saka sa APA, pagka-approve na yung advanced pricing arrangement mo, hindi ka na ma-question doon sa pricing, no, during audit. Retention requirement, no? Ito na yung sinasabi ko sa inyo kanina na during my lecture doon sa bookkeeping, yung retention requirement na 10 years na, hindi na yung dating 5 years, no? And you have to retain your records such that hindi siya masira, hindi siya mabasa, no? Para pagkailangan, mabilis lang i-retrieve. Okay, so retention period in general, transfer pricing documents must be retained, preserved within the period specifically provided in the tax code as the retention period, no, which is 10 years, unless a different period is otherwise legally provided, no? So it is to the best interest of the taxpayer to maintain documentation for purposes of MAP and possible transfer pricing examinations. Kasi kasama na ngayon sa tax audit ang transfer pricing, no? So titingnan niya ng examiner, so may related parties to. So, kasama talaga sa investigation. Kasi may separate requirement siya na nire-require. No? So, anong klase ng documentation ang nire-require? Contemporaneous. No? So, the transfer pricing documents must be contemporaneous. When we say contemporaneous, ang sabi dito, if the document exists or is brought into existence at the time the associated enterprises develop or implement any arrangement that might raise transfer pricing issues or review these arrangements when preparing tax returns. No? Okay, so contemporaneous existing at the time of the transactions. So what are the example of the documentation? These are the details. No? The details of the transfer pricing documents include but are not limited to the following. Number one, the organizational structure. So kasama po yan sa submit. No? The organizational structure, the nature of the business or industry and market conditions, the controlled transactions, assumptions, strategies, or policies, no? Kasama yan sa documents na ating isubmit. The cost contribution arrangements kung meron, comparability, functional, and risk analysis, no? Selection of the transfer pricing method, application of the transfer pricing method, background documents, and the index to documents. No? So yun yung mga kasama na information. Penalties, provisions of the tax code and other applicable laws. No? So, pag may person who fails to comply or violates the provision and requirements of the regulations. No? Okay. Okay, so this guidelines was recommended by Kim Jacinto Hinaris, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, at yung Secretary of Finance is Cesar Purisima. No? So, I have discussed to you yung transfer pricing guidelines as a way of review. Balikan lang po natin, no? Itong sabi natin na Revenue Regulations 2-2013, which is the transfer pricing guidelines, no? Hindi, ang profit split na yung 245. Yung beginning, RR 2-2013. Yung ibang transfer pricing law dito sa Pilipinas, sa ibang ano natin yan i-discuss, no, sa ibang schedule, no? So this RR 2-2013 is the transfer pricing guidelines dated January 23, 2013. So ano yung mga dinidiscuss dito, no? Yung methods ng transfer pricing, ano yung methods na discuss natin kanina sa inyo, the 5 methods, yung comparable uncontrolled price method, the resale price method, the cost plus method, profit split method, and the transactional net margin method. Yun yung 5 methods na sinasabi dito sa transfer pricing guidelines. At nandito rin yung mga comparability factors kung paano tayo mag-compare, no? What are the factors na i-compare natin? At ano yon? We have the number 1, characteristics or nature of the goods or services, tangible or intangible. No? So you have to compare them. And then ano pa? the functions, assets, and the risk, which are very important. And then we have to compare also the economic conditions, the business strategies, and the contractual terms, no? So yun yung 5 comparability factors, and those are very important when we study transfer pricing. And then ano pa yung sinasabi dito, who are related parties? And dinidiscuss din po dito yung control, no? At saka ano yung basis nitong transfer pricing guidelines? The transfer pricing law in the Philippines, which is embodied in our National Internal Revenue Code of 1997, is the Section 50 of the National Internal Revenue Code as amended. At anong sabi doon? The Commissioner has the authority to, tatlo yung pwede niyang gawin, no? Allocate, apportion, or distribute income or expenses, no, ng company na ang makikita niya na hindi isinama, halimbawa, overstated yung deductions, understated naman ang income, and the purpose is to avoid the, evasion of taxes, no? So yun yung transfer pricing law natin sa Pilipinas, Section 50 of the National Internal Revenue Code, which is exactly the same wordings with the Section 482 of the IRC or the Internal Revenue Code of the US, no? Kasi yung ating transfer pricing, ating taxation law, pattern natin yan sa US, no? Kaya yung mga precedent na cases nila, since matagal na sa kanila yung transfer pricing, pwede natin dito na precedent or yung mga jurisprudence nila, court decisions nila, pwede natin gamitin dito sa Pilipinas, no? So the same. But yung US, meron silang mga specific regulations that defines control, ano ba talaga yung control, no? And ang latest naman sa BAR, na aside from this RR 2-2013, gumawa na rin siya ng ramo or yung Revenue Audit Memorandum Order 1-2019, which is the Transfer Pricing Audit Guidelines. And yung latest, yun yung BIR Form 1709 for the transfer pricing documentation that should be attached during the filing of the annual income tax return for those companies who have related party transactions, no? Pero since bago lang siya, noong July 25, 2020 lang, yung requirement ng related party transactions under PAS 24, the Philippine Accounting Standards 24. So anong ginawa? In-extend po yung deadline, no? So iba-iba yung deadline. May December, may January, February, hanggang next year pa yung deadline, no? For the 2020 na mga filers of annual income tax return, no? At ano pa yung mga clarification under RMC 76/2020 doon sa submission ng mga documents ng related parties. Kung voluminous talaga at marami, pwede siyang ilagay sa DVD. Soft copy po ang submit na attachment. But of course, you are going to fill up the Form 1709 na form, no? And then attach it to your income tax return. Okay? May question ba?
May question, ma'am, isa po.
Okay, sige.
Pero bago po yun, ma'am, good evening daw po, sabi ni Ma'am Mutia Cora Colobo.
Okay. So,
Facebook po yun, ma'am.
yes, good evening din po, no? Thank you for watching. No?
Kasi,
Sige, anong question?
ito yung question po ni Cora Bruce Labrador.
Okay.
Tayo, ma'am, are we required to have transfer pricing documentation?
Yes, required po. Ano sabi niya? Are we required?
Are we required to have transfer pricing documentation?
Yes po. Yun yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na yung RR 19-2020 transfer pricing documentation po yan. You are going to fill up the BAR Form 1709 and i-attach po sa annual income tax return. No? Since marami yan, yung mga contracts nyo, yung mga sinasabi natin kanina dun sa comparability factors na yon, no? Documentation nyo, pwedeng ilagay nyo sa DVD, soft copy, and then i-attach nyo sa Form 1709, and then attach nyo sa annual income tax return. No? Mandatory requirements po ang transfer pricing documentation.
Lang po, ma'am.
So, wala na. So, with that, I would like to say thank you and good evening po, no? Stay tuned to our YouTube channel, itong Basic Transfer Pricing. No, although meron tayong tax training na YouTube channel, sa sobrang dami ng topic ng taxation, binukod ko po yung para sa basic transfer pricing para hindi maghalo-halo ang mga topics, so that kung anong topics ang gusto nyo, you want na transfer pricing, then may pupuntahan po kayo na channel. So with that, thank you very much, and sa mga subscribers natin, thank you very much din po.